Okay, so the second book which I wanted to show you in this spotlight session about our festive treasures is this book here. This is an older book. This book was published in 1823, and it's not specifically Christmas related, but it does have Christmas sections in it. And this is, as is often the case with the early 19th century books, a book with many different subtitles. So it's Ancient Mysteries Described, especially the English miracle plays, founded on apocryphal New Testament story, extant amongst the unpublished manuscripts in the British Museum, including notices of ecclesiastical shows, the festivals of Fools and Asses, the English Boy Bishop, the Descent into Hell, the Lord Mayor's Show, the Guildhall Giants, Christmas carols, etc. And it's by William Hone. Now this is actually a really interesting book, and the story of how this book came about is quite interesting too. So William Hone was a writer, a satiricist, and a bookseller. He was a radical journalist, and he lived from 1780 to 1842. So the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. He is mostly renowned now for a court case in 1817 when he was taken to court for publishing seditious material, which is now seen as one of the key moments in the fight for freedom of the press. So that was that's what he's mostly renowned for. So he was born in Bath but moved to London when he was aged 3, and he trained as a solicitor's clerk, but he developed an interest in socialism and in, for instance, extending the franchise to working men. So he was a radical right from a young age. He started a book and print shop with a circulating library attached, so obviously feels quite close to our heart here in Bromley House. And he then went on to be an auctioneer for a London bookseller, as well as developing his interest in journalism. So his journalism was investigative journalism, which was quite rare at the time. He investigated the conditions in mental institutions such as Bedlam, and he also published satirical parodies, many of which were illustrated by George Cruikshank, who was obviously one of the most famous illustrators of those kinds of material at the time. As I say, in 1817, he was put on trial for 3 of these things that he had published, with the prosecutors alleging that these were things that were harmful to the public morals and that would bring religion and the prayer book into contempt. He was eventually acquitted on all 3 counts after a rather gruelling trial, each of the 3 counts each of the 3 cases being overseen by a different judge, each of whom were not particularly sympathetic to him. But he was eventually acquitted. Now, this book is one of the incidental results of that trial, because in the course of researching for the trial, he looked into all sorts of different material, including, as it says in the title of the book, some of the unpublished material that was held in the British Museum. And he created this book as a sort of afterthought after the trial. So a lot of the material that he researched, which he felt was worthy of being published. So this book, he wrote one book before this, which was called The Apocryphal New Testament, which he says in the introduction to that book that he published in order to explain the pictures and references that people may find in other literary works or in works of art, which related to the stories in the Apocrypha that weren't well known at the time. And this book is following on from that and looking at some of the traditions of plays which were put on in the medieval period around the country, performing some of these stories from the Apocrypha that were not generally well known in the early 19th century when this William Hone was writing this book. So the book is it's interesting. It talks about these miracle plays, the mystery plays, which were originally performed by monks in various places around the country, and they were often performed as a cycle of plays. They weren't necessarily Christmas plays. They were often performed throughout the year. Many of them were looking at incidents from other parts of the Bible, but there was a tradition of these mystery plays being performed in the Christmas period. And some of them are specifically related to the Christmas story. So, for instance, in here we have little wood blocks which look at various different parts of Christ's story, but they do include parts of the Christmas story, like this rather delightful little picture of the three wise men here, taken from a carol sheet. Carols, of course, being religious songs that were related to various times of the year, Christmas carols just being one subset of carols. So there are things within this that relate to the Christmas period. The information is mostly just published from the papers that had been found in the British Museum without a great deal of interpretation and discussion. But the information that's in here is very interesting, and it also includes some of the other traditions of the period. For instance, the tradition of boy bishops, which was a tradition across much of Europe, actually, whereby on the 6th of December, so the feast day of St Nicholas, who was the patron saint of children, a boy from within the local community would be elected as a bishop, and he would sit on the bishop's throne, and he would have authority as the bishop of the town until the Feast of the Holy Innocents, which was on the 28th of December. So he kind of parodied a real bishop. And this was also related to things like the Feast of Fools, the Feast of Asses, where the general order of things was in a controlled way turned upside down for a while. So this was part of the traditional Christmas time celebrations, and this is also explained in this book. So, as I say, this book, not entirely Christmas related, but does include some really interesting information about previous traditions that were happening in the Christmas period and where those traditions came from and how we know about them. So this book, as it was a kind of byproduct of Hone's research for the trial that he was that he was being put on trial, but it's ended up being a very interesting and rather fascinating part of our collection.